There is a stretch of land in the Pacific Northwest where you can technically live without paying rent, without owning property, and without anyone checking whether you're supposed to be there at all. You would be living in a place so remote, so economically irrelevant, and so physically uncomfortable that most people pass through once and never return. This is not a government program, not a sustainability experiment, and not a lifestyle trend. It exists because the land is forgotten, unwanted, and functionally abandoned. The Pacific Northwest is usually associated with soaring real estate prices, million-dollar cabins, and wealthy retirees competing for waterfront views. But what almost nobody talks about are the territories, islands, and unincorporated zones where land has effectively fallen outside the system. Places where enforcement disappeared, economies collapsed, and nature reclaimed most of what humans built. This video counts down 10 forgotten Pacific Northwest territories where you can technically live for free. Some of these places are sinking, some are freezing, some are slowly being swallowed by forests and storms. Others are controlled by government agencies that simply do not bother enforcing rules year-round. But if you want the truth about where free still technically exists in the Pacific Northwest, this is where it begins. Let us break it down. Before we do, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our videos, and let us know what you would like to see us cover next. Number 10 is the Olympic Peninsula Interior Forest Zones in Washington. This is not a town, not an island, and not an organized community. It is a vast stretch of dense rainforest, abandoned logging land, and lightly monitored public and private parcels scattered throughout the interior of the Olympic Peninsula. Outside of the national park boundaries, large areas of former logging land were sold, abandoned, or left in legal limbo when timber companies collapsed or moved on. In these zones, especially far from highways and paved access roads, enforcement is minimal and sometimes non-existent. People quietly occupy abandoned cabins, old logging shacks, or build improvised shelters deep in the forest. Here is what free actually means in this context. You are not paying rent. You are not paying property taxes. You are not legally entitled to be there. But if you stay far enough from roads, keep a low profile, and do not draw attention, nobody comes looking. Living costs can be close to zero if you rely on rainwater collection, wood for heat, and minimal supplies hauled in periodically. Food costs might run $200 to $300 per month if you are extremely frugal and supplement with foraging or fishing. Fuel costs for occasional supply runs can be $100 per month. Total monthly expenses can stay under $400 per month if you accept extreme simplicity. This works because the land is vast, rugged, and economically useless. Timber is gone. Development is impossible. The weather is brutal for most of the year with constant rain, mold, and darkness. That alone discourages almost everyone. The downside is severe and unavoidable. There is no medical access. Injuries can become fatal. Winter storms isolate you completely. The forest is damp year-round, destroying clothing, tools, and shelter. Black bears, cougars, and falling trees are real risks. And if authorities decide to enforce land ownership or trespassing laws, you have no protection. One long-term squatter described living in an abandoned logging cabin for 4 years without ever seeing law enforcement. Their costs were minimal, but the isolation was intense, and the constant dampness slowly destroyed everything they owned. They eventually left after a winter storm collapsed part of the structure. Number 9. Northern Vancouver Island Coastal Fringe. This is the far northwest coast of the island, near Holberg and beyond. This is not the tourist-facing Vancouver Island most people imagine. Once you pass the last paved roads and small settlements, you enter a stretch of coastline littered with abandoned fishing shacks, former logging camps, and structures left behind when industries collapsed and never returned. These areas are technically under Canadian jurisdiction, but enforcement is sporadic, seasonal, and often non-existent outside of summer months. People quietly occupy old cabins, live on beached boats, or build informal shelters on crown land near the coast. Free living here means no rent, no utilities, and no services. Monthly costs can be extremely low if you accept isolation. Food costs can be kept around $250 per month if you rely on dry goods and occasional fishing. Fuel for generators or small boats might add another $100 per month. Rainwater collection eliminates water bills entirely. Total monthly expenses can stay under $400 per month if you live very simply. This works because the area is remote, wet, and economically irrelevant. Logging operations shut down decades ago. Fishing employment collapsed, and tourism never developed due to poor access and constant storms. The weather is relentlessly harsh. Rain can fall for weeks without stopping. Winter storms cut off access completely. There is no hospital nearby, no police presence most of the year, and no infrastructure worth maintaining. The downside is brutal. Mold destroys everything. Isolation is absolute. Emergency evacuation is unlikely in bad weather. Supplies require long, dangerous trips by boat or rough logging roads. Wildlife encounters with bears and wolves are common. One former logger described living in an abandoned fishing cabin for nearly 3 years, paying nothing for housing, and surviving on savings and fishing. They eventually left due to health issues caused by damp conditions and the psychological toll of isolation. Number 8. The Haida Gwaii Interior Forest Zones. This area in British Columbia sits away from small coastal villages and ferry terminals. Haida Gwaii is often portrayed as mystical and pristine, but very few people talk about the abandoned inland places where former logging roads disappear into dense rainforest, and human presence has largely vanished. Outside of Haida communities and designated protected lands, there are stretches of interior forest where old camps, derelict cabins, and forgotten infrastructure still exist, slowly being reclaimed by moss and trees. Living here for free means occupying abandoned structures or informal shelters on Crown land, far from any regular oversight. Monthly costs can be extremely low if you accept total self-reliance. Food expenses might average $250 per month if you rely on shelf-stable supplies supplemented by fishing and foraging. Fuel for a generator or chainsaw might add $100. Rainwater collection covers water needs. Total monthly costs can stay under $400 if you live minimally. This arrangement works because the island's interior is economically useless, environmentally protected in many areas, and deeply hostile to long-term human comfort. Constant rain, dense vegetation, and poor access discourage settlement. Enforcement is minimal, simply because there is no reason for authorities to patrol areas no one visits. The downside is relentless. Haida Gwaii receives extreme rainfall, creating constant dampness, mold, and rot. Medical access is extremely limited, with evacuation dependent on weather and long transport times. Winter darkness and isolation are psychologically taxing. Wildlife encounters are common, and storms can isolate you completely for weeks. One person who lived inland for over a year described the experience as hauntingly beautiful, but mentally exhausting. They paid nothing for housing, but everything they owned slowly deteriorated from moisture, and the isolation became overwhelming. Number 7. San Juan Islands Fringe Zones. Number 7 covers the outer San Juan Islands fringe zones in Washington state, specifically the smaller uninhabited or semi-abandoned islands that sit beyond the ferry-served communities. Most people think of the San Juans as wealthy, exclusive, and completely out of reach financially, and that is true for places like Orcas or San Juan Island itself. But scattered beyond them are tiny islands and shoreline parcels that were once used for homesteading, seasonal fishing camps, or informal settlements and then quietly abandoned. Some of these areas fall into legal gray zones involving disputed ownership, neglected easements, or landlocked parcels that nobody actively monitors. Living for free here means occupying an abandoned structure, squatting on unused land, or living aboard an unregistered or derelict boat pulled up on shore. Monthly costs can be extremely low if you accept a bare-bones existence. Food costs can stay around $300 per month if you rely on dry goods and fishing. Boat fuel or occasional mainland transport may add $100 to $150 per month. With rainwater collection and no utilities, total monthly expenses can hover around $450 per month. The downsides are serious and unavoidable. There is no medical access. Weather can trap you completely. Tides and currents are dangerous even for experienced boaters. Winter storms can destroy shelters overnight. Legal status is uncertain, and eviction is always possible if attention is drawn. One former liveaboard described pulling an abandoned sailboat onto a rocky shoreline and living there for nearly 2 years without paying rent or taxes. They survived cheaply, but eventually left after repeated winter storms damaged the hull, and isolation took a toll. Number 6. The remote coastal inlets of Southeast Alaska. These fall outside incorporated towns and regular ferry routes. They are not islands most people recognize, but long stretches of shoreline carved by fjords, bays, and forested peninsulas where former fishing camps, canneries, and logging outposts were abandoned decades ago. In many of these inlets, old cabins still exist, slowly collapsing into the trees, reachable only by small boat or float plane. Living here for free means quietly occupying one of those abandoned structures or building a minimal shelter on state land in places no one visits. Monthly costs can be kept extremely low if you already have access. Food might run around $300 per month if you rely on dry goods and supplement with fishing. Fuel for a skiff or small generator may add another $150. With rainwater collection and wood heat, utilities cost nothing. Total monthly expenses can remain under $500 if you live very simply. This works because Southeast Alaska is vast, sparsely populated, and economically irrelevant outside a few hubs. Enforcement resources are limited, and authorities have little reason to patrol uninhabited inlets. The weather alone acts as a deterrent. Rain is constant, winter darkness is long, and storms regularly isolate entire areas for weeks. The downsides are severe. Medical emergencies require expensive evacuation by boat or float plane if weather allows. Bears are common and aggressive around food sources. Mold and rot destroy shelters and supplies. Isolation is absolute, and psychological strain builds quickly. One person who lived in an abandoned fishing cabin for over a year described paying nothing for housing, but said the isolation and constant dampness were harder than expected. They eventually left after a winter storm damaged the roof and resupply became impossible for over a month. Number 5. Inland Crown Land Zones of Central British Columbia. These areas are far from towns, highways, and any meaningful oversight. They are vast interior territories once used for mining, trapping, and logging, now largely abandoned as industries collapsed or consolidated elsewhere. Old access roads fade into forest, and scattered across these regions are forgotten trapper cabins, derelict trailers, and the remains of work camps that no one maintains. Living here for free means quietly occupying one of these abandoned structures or building a minimal shelter on Crown land in areas that see no regular patrols. Monthly costs can be extremely low if you accept isolation and self-reliance. Food expenses can be kept around $250 per month if you rely on bulk dry goods and occasional hunting or fishing. Fuel for generators or supply runs might add $100 to $150 per month. With wood heat and water from nearby streams or snowmelt, utilities cost nothing. Total monthly expenses can remain under $400 per month if you live simply. This works because these regions are enormous, sparsely populated, and economically irrelevant. There is no incentive for development, tourism, or enforcement. Winters are long and unforgiving, with heavy snow and temperatures well below freezing, and that climate discourages all but the most determined individuals. Medical access is nearly non-existent. Winter isolation can last months. Vehicles frequently fail in extreme cold. Wildlife encounters with bears and wolves are common. Legal status is uncertain, and eviction is possible if attention is drawn. One former prospector described living in an abandoned cabin for 2 winters, paying nothing for housing, and surviving on savings and hunting. He eventually left after a severe winter damaged the structure and made access impossible. Number 4. The remote Olympic Coast Strip in Washington State. This is the stretch of rugged Pacific coastline where cliffs, dense rainforest, and violent surf make access difficult and settlement undesirable. Scattered along this coast are abandoned fishing shacks, old homestead remains, and informal campsites that were once used seasonally and then left behind. Some sit on contested or poorly monitored land where jurisdiction shifts between county authorities, state agencies, and federal oversight that rarely extends into the winter months. Living here for free means occupying one of these forgotten structures or building a minimal shelter hidden from main trails. Monthly costs can be extremely low if you accept complete isolation. Food expenses might average $250 to $300 per month if you rely on dry goods and occasional fishing. Fuel for rare supply trips could add $100 per month. Rainwater collection covers water needs, and driftwood provides fuel for heat. Total monthly expenses can stay under $450 per month if you live at the edge of comfort. This works because the Olympic coast is physically hostile. Storms are frequent, access is limited, and tourism drops to nearly zero outside summer. Enforcement is minimal because patrols focus on popular beaches, not remote headlands. The downside is severe and immediate. Storm surge can destroy shelters overnight. Hypothermia is a constant risk. Medical emergencies are often fatal due to delayed rescue. Bears and cougars roam freely. Isolation is total for long stretches of time. One individual described living in an abandoned fishing shack for over a year, paying nothing for shelter, but constantly repairing storm damage. They eventually left after a winter storm collapsed part of the structure. Number 3. The Northern Cascade Foothills in Washington. This refers to the abandoned and semi-abandoned zones beyond maintained Forest Service roads, where former mining claims, logging camps, and seasonal settlements were left behind decades ago. This is not the postcard version of the Cascades with ski resorts and vacation cabins. These are steep valleys and forested slopes where access roads have washed out, ownership records are fragmented, and human presence has slowly faded. Living here for free means quietly occupying an abandoned mining cabin, an old logging structure, or establishing a minimal shelter on land that no longer sees regular enforcement. Monthly costs can be extremely low if you live with discipline. Food expenses might stay around $250 per month if you rely on bulk staples and occasional foraging. Fuel for rare trips into town or for running a chainsaw and a generator may add another $100. With stream water and wood heat, utilities cost nothing. Total monthly expenses can remain under $400. This works because these foothill zones are economically useless and physically difficult. Steep terrain, heavy snowfall, and landslides make development impractical, and agencies rarely patrol areas where no one is supposed to be year-round. The downsides are harsh. Winters bring deep snow that can trap you for months. Avalanches and falling trees are real risks. Medical help is effectively unreachable in winter. Isolation can become psychologically overwhelming. One former squatter described living in an abandoned mining cabin for 3 years, paid nothing for housing, but eventually leaving after repeated winters damaged the structure and access roads completely collapsed. Number 2. Southeast Alaska's unincorporated islands. These are islands that technically appear on maps, but functionally sit outside daily governance. They are islands without towns, without ferry docks, and without any permanent infrastructure, scattered throughout the Inside Passage but far from established communities like Ketchikan or Petersburg. Many were briefly used for logging camps, fish processing, or seasonal trapping, then abandoned when operations shut down. What remains are collapsing cabins, rusting docks, and stretches of land that nobody visits for years at a time. Living here for free means occupying one of these abandoned structures, or building a minimal shelter on state land where enforcement is rare simply because access is so difficult. Monthly costs can be extremely low once established. Food expenses might average $300 per month if you rely on shelf-stable goods supplemented by fishing. Fuel for a skiff or a small generator may add another $150. With rainwater collection and wood heat, there are no utility costs. Total monthly expenses can remain under $500 if you live minimally. This works because these islands are inconvenient, wet, and economically worthless. There is no tourism, no development pressure, and no reason for authorities to patrol them regularly. The downside is extreme. Medical evacuation is expensive and weather-dependent. Storms can isolate you completely for weeks. Bears are common, and food storage is a constant challenge. Mold and rot destroy buildings and supplies. Isolation is total, and winter darkness lasts for months. One person who lived on an unnamed island for nearly 2 years said they paid nothing for shelter, but the isolation and constant dampness slowly wore them down. They eventually left after a medical issue required an evacuation they could barely afford. Number 1, the far western edge of the Pacific Northwest wilderness is where Alaska, ocean, and isolation converge most realistically for long-term survival without rent. This is Prince of Wales Island's most remote interior and coastal fringe zones, away from towns, ferry terminals, and maintained roads. Unlike purely illegal squatting locations, this region offers a rare combination of vast available land, minimal oversight, and a legal path to ownership that keeps costs extremely low. But even without ownership, people quietly occupy abandoned hunting cabins, former logging shelters, and unused parcels where no one checks residency. Living here for free means no rent, no utilities, and no services. Monthly costs can be kept around $450 to $600 if you rely on fishing, hunting, and bulk supplies. Fuel and boat access might add another $150 per month. Property taxes, if you eventually purchase land, are under $200 annually, but squatting costs nothing. This works because Prince of Wales is enormous, sparsely populated, and economically stagnant. Land is cheap because few people want to live with constant rain, isolation, and limited opportunity. The island has small towns and ferry access, but vast areas remain functionally ungoverned, simply due to scale and terrain. The downside is relentless. Rain falls more than 200 days per year. Winter darkness lasts months. Bears are a constant presence. Medical care requires travel by ferry or expensive evacuation. Employment is nearly non-existent. Isolation is real even compared to other remote places. One long-term resident described buying land for under $20,000 after living for years in an abandoned cabin without paying rent. Monthly costs were minimal, but the mental strain of darkness and isolation was harder than expected. Picture yourself on a remote Alaska island shoreline. You fish for food, haul water, and watch storms roll in for days at a time. The ferry connects you to the outside world only occasionally. You are living for free or nearly free, but only because you have accepted conditions most people would never tolerate. What do these 10 forgotten Pacific Northwest territories actually prove? That free living still technically exists, but only in places abandoned by the modern world. Free means isolation, danger, legal uncertainty, and constant discomfort. It means rain, cold, darkness, and silence. It means no hospitals, no police, and no safety net. The places where living costs nothing are the places where almost no one wants to stay. Be honest with yourself. Could you actually live like this for years? Not as a temporary experiment, but as a life? Or is this just a romanticized survival fantasy viewed from a warm room with reliable electricity? Like this video if you learned that free living in the Pacific Northwest means trading comfort for isolation. Subscribe because this channel shows where cheap and free still technically exist, even when the reality is harsher than the dream.